I remember your election vividly when you were running for senator of Alabama. And this was a time that I used to go on Fox News. I refuse to go on now. But I remember saying that it's not going to happen, that I just don't see Mr. Doug Jones winning. And I was wrong. And I was so happy to be wrong because we hadn't seen a Democratic senator in a very long time when you were going against that other guy. But you also had a phenomenal record prosecuting former Klan members 40 years later. You had a really good record. I just wanted to know, as we talk about the South changing and we look at areas like Georgia, maybe even Louisiana, what was your strategy? What was your plan to bring out maybe non-voters, to especially bring out black voters? You had a high black voter turnout. Back then, 2017, what was your strategy?
Clay, I appreciate you saying it because it was an amazing race. It was an amazing night of December 12th, 2017. You can't imagine the number of people from all over the country over the last 5 years who every time I see them, they talk about where they were on December 12th, 2017. I had not really bargained for the hope that I think that election gave after a year of Donald Trump. But our strategy, quite frankly, was pretty simple going into it. And that was, we knew it was going to be a special election. Remember, this was not a November general election. This was a special election. We were going to be the only thing on the ballot in Alabama and really across the country. So we assumed for the moment then, as we went into it, that it was going to be a low turnout. And so we really were targeting the voters that we believed were likely Democratic voters. That included the African-American community in Alabama. It included certain suburbs and others. That's who we were targeting for all of our get out the vote efforts. We had to expand that as once the allegations against Judge Roy Moore came out, that really expanded the electorate. We really went from expecting maybe 800 to 850,000 people voting in that special election till we ended up at 1.3 million. And so we really faced a lot of challenges with all the emphasis and the attention that the race got because we knew more people would come out. And that's when we did have to expand a lot to voters that were either going to be first-time voters for Democrats or first-time voters in general. And I think the message that we had resonated with those kind of folks. It was really a voice that hadn't been heard in Alabama politics in a long time.
So let me ask you this, speaking of Alabama specifically, was it a fluke? Was it a one-time moment? It was a special election. I mean, are we going to see, do we have to wait another quarter of a century?
No, I don't think we're going to have to wait another quarter of a century, but I would be less than candid if I didn't say that it was that I think what we were offering was at the right place at the right time in a unique moment, and we seized that moment. The reason why it was so important, the reason why you will see it without having to wait another 25 years is because we were able to use that moment, not just for that to win an election, but to establish a base and to start talking in ways that haven't been talked about in years, a long, long time. Talking for all the people in Alabama of all races, of all religions, trying to make sure that all boats get lifted by one single rising tide. And that continues today in Alabama. Alabama demographics are changing. We're trying to get more young people voting because they still don't vote in the same number as their older counterparts. The younger population is a much more diverse, more progressive than their older counterparts. So we've still got a lot of work to do, and it's a slow process. And we told people at the time, my election was not turning Alabama blue or even purple. It was going to be a long process, but we're working on it. I think we started that process in 2017. We built that base that we're continuing today, and you're going to see some things. This is not going to be a great year for us in Alabama, but in 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, it's going to be.
Well, it's interesting because I always say this to my friends who get disenchanted, they don't want to vote. I say it's the long game. That's essentially what it is. And the GOP, I'm not on their team, but their long game is pretty incredible. They plotted 50 years to overturn Roe v. Wade, and they were patient, and they made it happen.
Clay, you're exactly right. And I couldn't really say this when you're a candidate, okay? You can't really tell people that, look, even coming out to vote for a losing candidate makes a difference. I couldn't really say that when I was running because it would almost sound defeatist. But it's true, especially in a state like Alabama and some of these other states, that the more folks that you can get out to vote, the more a difference you're going to make. And as you narrow that gap, these folks that are winning these races are going to have to pay attention. And that means paying attention to the policies and things that go on in the state and trying to move the state forward. So every vote counts. Just look what had happened. Look what would have happened in Kansas just 2 weeks ago, or a week or so ago, had the folks in Kansas had that same attitude. Well, it's really not going to matter. We're a conservative state, so we really don't need to get out and vote to prohibit our legislature from taking away a woman's right to choose. We wouldn't have had that incredible victory that we saw so many people coming out and being registered, so many folks coming out and voting for the first time because their vote did make a difference. It made a huge difference.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. I have to ask you this. You grew up in segregated Alabama. I was born in 1977, and although my grandfather was born and raised in the Jim Crow South in Virginia, he would have some horror stories. And I'm just curious to know, I keep hearing that we're moving backwards. And I'm a little bit hesitant to say that because I don't know that time. I have some callers who call in and say, yes, we are. I have some callers that call in and say, no, we're not. We're not going that far backwards. But as somebody who grew up in segregated Alabama, do you think that we are going back to a scary time of a version of Jim Crow that's alive and well? My fear is they want to overturn the 1964 Civil Rights Act. I think that's their long game. But am I going too far? Are we being too drastic with it? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think you have to be concerned. I do think we have been sliding backwards on both race relations as well as rights and liberties. We see what the Supreme Court of the United States has been doing just in the last couple of months before they adjourned. And I have been saying now for quite a while that I thought the country was sliding back on their race relations, but it was in part due to more political. The Jim Crow era was an era, post-Reconstruction, that really was about pure racism and hatred for folks. I think to some extent, clearly that still exists. And unfortunately, we've seen a rise in white nationalists, particularly under the former president, that have felt emboldened to come out from behind the internet and take to the streets, take to the Capitol on January 6th. But I also think that there's a lot of political power levers being pulled behind some of that too by folks who are using that base of voters to try to maintain political power. And it's a scary time we're living in, Clay. There's no question about it. And I do see a rise. I don't think, hopefully we're not going to go back as far as, I think it'll be impossible really to do away with the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act. But I do see that things can be constricted so much by the Supreme Court that we are seeing segregated patterns of housing, education, and we've got to try to figure out how to do that. Clay, it's really interesting that I've had this conversation a lot in the last couple of months after watching so much of the January 6th hearing and seeing how the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, who are truly white supremacists, have come out. The United States of America, if you really think about this, the United States of America is really the only country in the history of the world that was destined to be a multicultural, multiracial society. It was always destined to be that. Unlike every other country in the world that still exists, this country was different. And we are a young country in the history of this world. And we've still got a lot of growing pains to understand each other and to know that we can all live in the same house together and be one big family. That's difficult. It's difficult for people to accept. A lot of people feel threatened. And we got to do a better job of making sure everybody of all walks of life and all races of all levels of society understand that, and that democracy is about empathy and caring for each other and trying to let everybody have an equal opportunity.
Let me ask you this, and I could totally be wrong. Again, we're talking to Doug Jones, former senator of Alabama. I'm in a space right now where I don't even want to engage the GOP. And I think about Frederick Douglass. He wasn't trying to reason with racist Southern Democrats. He didn't say we have to see their side. We have to understand where they're coming from. And I think for me, and I could totally be wrong and be way too stubborn, I feel like there's too much reasoning with the GOP. I feel like there's too much sympathizing. But I could be wrong. I don't live in a red state. I'm in the Jersey, New York area. What do I know? And I want to know from your perspective, am I seeing it the wrong way? Am I seeing it the wrong way, thinking we just can't reason with the Mitch McConnells? We just can't reason with the Rand Pauls? Or am I being too stubborn?
I don't think you're being too stubborn, but I don't believe it's the way forward, just in all candor. Number one, if you look at what's going on right now, the Democratic Party finally is beginning to see that they are having a governing majority. Remember what happened in the early days of the Biden administration, that except for the American Rescue Plan, we couldn't get our own house in order because everybody was saying we can't reason with people, including members of our own party. And I think we have to start I believe that that's what democracy is about, that we have to start reasoning. And there are those people that you cannot reason with. There are people on the left that you cannot reason with. And there's the dilemma. And that's why I think the best approach is to try to reason with everyone to get some path forward. And I could be wrong too, but I think that that's the best hope for this country. I've always believed it's where the country has been. The one time that it didn't result in a civil war and we lost close to 1 million of men on both the North and the South, I don't want to see that happen again. And I think that we can do that because I believe, and I could be wrong too, but I believe that this country is more in a position of being reasonable and working with each other than the extremes. Unfortunately, Clay, one of the things that we see right now because of social media, because we have 24-hour news at our fingertips on our telephones that we've never had before until recent memory, people tend to not want to do that reason. They tend to see things, I think, as the other side being evil and the other side being unreasonable. I don't believe that's where the majority of Americans are. That's not what I see when I go out in the country speaking. I see a lot of people wanting folks to work together. But one of the problems that we got is both our media access, but also gerrymandered legislatures and gerrymandered Congress, where people don't have to address each other. If we get rid of gerrymandering, Clay, I know I would be right and you would be wrong, but we got to get rid of gerrymandered political districts in this country so that everybody needs, all the public people, all the folks running for office are reaching out to their entire constituency, not just a small band of people that they can get a particular nomination for.
A couple key things I just wanted to ask you specifically, just to get your thoughts on, as somebody who was in the U.S. Senate. A big topic that comes up on this show is reparations. And being from Alabama, I'm sure you know the gruesome history of slavery, sharecropping, Jim Crow in Alabama. Do you ever see us getting to a space where there will be specific reparations for Black Americans on a federal level? Or do you think it has to be locally?
You know, that's a great question. I wish I had a really good answer for it. When I was in the Senate, I was a co-sponsor of a bill that Cory Booker introduced that would try to figure this out. That would create, this is not something that I think one piece of legislation at this point in this time and for the foreseeable future. I don't think somebody can introduce a bill and get this done. I think you are going to have to do something, a federally mandated study to try to figure out. And I know that sounds like a cop-out to a lot of people, but the fact is it's a very, very complex issue. And it may end up being that the federal government can do certain things. It may, though, be local folks. It could even be more targeted and you expand from that. For instance, there is certain things that you could start in different ways. In Alabama, if you remember a couple of years, back when I was in the Senate, so it's been more than a couple now, they discovered the Clotilda. The Clotilda was the last slave ship that came into the United States. Slavery had been banned, and the ship landed in right outside of Mobile in Mobile Bay. It was burned, and there are still direct descendants of the slaves from the Clotilda in the Mobile area. It's called a place called Africatown. And it may very well be that you can start with a more targeted, very clear reparations. I don't know, but I'm just throwing things out there. I know that it is incredibly complex and politically sensitive. I believe that Cory Booker was on the right track with his bill to try to figure this out. And that's why I co-sponsored.
Okay, this is a big question. I know you aren't in Mississippi, but I got to ask you this. Again, I said earlier, you prosecuted former Klan members 40 years later. That was some great work that you did. There is this talk of an unserved arrest warrant being found for Carolyn Bryant. She is the person who accused Emmett Till of doing something, and it appears that she lied. And there are a lot of folks saying there is an unserved arrest warrant. I know it's 1957. But Mississippi said they can't do anything. The case is closed. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, she's still alive. She's still alive, 87 years old, I believe, living in Kentucky, I believe.
Yeah, look, I followed that case fairly closely over the years. I've done a number of interviews about it. I've always believed that the case against her was very thin for a lot of different reasons. And the fact that the only thing that you've really got at this point that you could use was some statements from her that she may have lied to a couple of people, including the sheriff, which is the lies themselves, the statute of limitations is run. But let's walk through this procedure, because I think a lot of people don't fully understand some of the criminal procedures. The arrest warrant was not a charge. It was simply something that law enforcement had. They would have had to bring her to the courthouse, have her a preliminary hearing or some kind of hearing, and then determine whether or not a grand jury would indict her. The arrest warrant does not do that. The arrest warrant is only the beginning of a step in a longer process that would ultimately result. The only way charges could have been brought was a grand jury. So as I understand from reading the news this week, folks over in Mississippi did in fact present evidence to a grand jury in Mississippi who declined to indict. And I think that there's a lot of reasons for that, including the fact that despite some evidence we know that her husband was involved in the kidnapping and the murder, and we know she may have lied about some things. It's still pretty thin, to be honest with you, about trying to prove beyond a reasonable doubt the very specific charge of either murder or kidnapping. So I can't, from my perspective, say I was too surprised. I think it's unfortunate because my gut tells me that there was more involvement from her than meets the eye. Proving it, I can tell you from experience, is a far different cry. And it's a different story when you've got to have admissible evidence in a court of law. I keep telling people that about the January 6th committee. Don't think that you can just take this evidence and put it in a court of law against Donald Trump or anyone else. You can't. So having that admissible evidence, I think, was going to be very, very tough, given the age of that case and the fact that about the only person alive is a potential defendant.
Before you go, last question. Again, I know it's a big question. You just mentioned Trump. Do you see him being held accountable in any capacity? To the average American looking, many of us heard him on tape asking for votes. It appears Watergate would be minimal compared to the things that we've seen Trump do. But do you see him being held accountable in any capacity whatsoever?
Being held accountable can take many forms, Clay. And most people, when they talk about that, it can be all the way from indictment on a criminal charge and going to prison, to being disqualified from office, to being held accountable for his business dealings in a civil court of law. So I quite frankly think that the former president is being held accountable today in one way because of the scrutiny that he is under as a former president of the United States, or as a businessman from New York or Mar-a-Lago, wherever the hell he ends up residing right now. So I think we're seeing some accountability through the January 6th committee. I think we're seeing it through some of these investigations. How far that will take, I don't know. I think there are still a ways to go. And I think particularly with the Department of Justice, they've got a very difficult decision because on the one hand, in this country, no one is above the law, not even a former president. The Attorney General of the United States has made that very clear. as would have any Attorney General of the United States. But putting that into a practical effect and having admissible evidence that can prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt is simply different, and a different analysis that they have to make. Then you just have to weigh the fact of the strength of that evidence with the policy of indicting a former president. This is a very incredibly consequential investigation, and the decisions that are going to be made are incredibly consequential, that are going to have long-term impacts on this country, and longer-term impacts for those seeking office, and particularly seeking the office of the presidency. So they're not going to be taken lightly. And I think we've got a ways to go, but I've said this before and I'm going to say it again. I think what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 weeks from the Department of Justice is confirmation of what I've said all along, and that the department is doing its job, and they're doing it in a non-political fashion.
Are you going to run for office again, Mr. Jones?
I don't know, Clay. I'm staying very engaged. I'm trying to help former colleagues and others that want to get to the Senate around the country. I'm helping in various state things here in Alabama and other places in the country. I think there are voices like mine that are out there that need to come up. So you never say never about some things, but right now I'm really trying to busy, because I had this conversation with someone yesterday that's running for re-election as a governor, and she asked me about it, and I told her, I said, I'm concerned about this democracy. I really am concerned about where I see the tribalism and the polarization in this country going. And I think I've got a voice that can help in that. And so I want to make sure to stay active, engaged, because at the end of the day, this is not about a political party, it's about this country. And I think that we're losing a little sight of that. And I want more people to think that way and not just think about political power. So who knows? We'll see. In the meantime, I'm going to keep coming back to your show.